Giordano Bruno and Infinity by Roswell Park and L. Williams. Edited by David Christopher Lane. Narrated by Michael Clower. Giordano Bruno, Roswell Park. The Renaissance was the fourth of the great events in the history of the Christian era, the first being the decline of Rome, the second the introduction of the Christian cult, and the third the intrusion into southern Europe of the Teutonic and Slavonic tribes. With none of these, however, save the fourth, is this paper primarily concerned, and not even with the fourth save indirectly, though it deals with a special feature of it. Protestants and Catholics alike impeded progress in the self-evolution of reason in every possible way. Italy gave the world the Roman Republic, then the Roman Empire, and finally the Roman Church. After that arose a new storm center in the north, which swept toward the Mediterranean. The Teutons effaced the Western Empire, adopted Christianity, and completely modified what remained of the Latin civilization. Then the Roman bishops separated the Latin from the Greek Church, and under the captious title of the Holy Roman Empire, bound Western Europe into what has been called a cohesive whole. While Romans and Teutons never actually blended homogeneously, they had yet a common bond of union. When this coalition was for a time freed from both papacy and empire, then began intellectual activity and independence of thought, taking form in Italy as the Renaissance, in Germany as the Reformation. In the South it was known as the Revival of Learning. It furnished a lux a non lucendo. Italy gave freedom rather to the mind, Germany rather to the soul. Toward the South men still took refuge behind that form of modified paganism which became Catholicism. In the North they attained a more complete emancipation because of the violent opposition to the papacy and all that went with it. In the long run both attained the same result, i.e. liberation of the mind from artificial impediments and fetters, though they of the North achieved it in its full extent far earlier. I'm speaking, of course, relatively. Men's minds are far from free even today, but the state we have reached is a great advance upon those of Bruno's time. The Reformation led men to be far more outspoken than they dared be in the South. The freethinkers of Italy were still content to do homage to a thoroughly corrupt papal hierarchy. As critics and warriors, Luther and Calvin rank as liberators of the human mind, but later, as founders of mutually hostile sects, they only retarded civilization, and the churches they founded are today as stagnant pools. In 1548, in the midst of this stormy period in Italian history, Bruno was born, in the little village of Nola, not far from Naples, whence Vesuvius was visible in the picturesque distance. His father was a soldier, his mother of very humble origin. Of his family history nothing is known. Little explanation is thus afforded by the doctrine of heredity for the marvelous mental faculties which he subsequently displayed. Nevertheless, his father was a man of some culture at least, for he was a friend of Tansilo, a poet under whose influence the growing boy subsequently came. Bruno has told us himself how one Savellino, probably an uncle, annually confessed his sins to his cure, of which, though many and great, his boon companion readily absolved him. But only once was full confession necessary. Each subsequent year Savellino would say, "Padre mio, the sins of a year, today, you may know them." To which the cure would reply, "Son, thou knowest the absolution of 1 year ago. Go in peace, and sin no more." In those days, as in many others, superstition was everywhere rife and effective. Its influence must not be disregarded as one studies the formation of Bruno's character. When he was about 11 years old, Bruno was sent to Naples to be taught logic, dialectics, and humanities. When 15, he entered the Dominican monastery in Naples, and assumed the clerical habit of that order. Here he gave up his baptismal name of Filippo and assumed that of Giordano, according to the monastic custom. In 1572 he was ordained priest. His reasons for thus entering the church are scarcely far to seek. Of intellectual bent, and studious rather than martial in his habits and inclinations, there was but one career open to him. To be sure, the Dominican order was the most narrow and most bigoted of all, as the current punning expression, Domini Canes, would indicate. Still, it was at that time the most powerful, especially in the kingdom of Naples, which was then ruled by Spain. The old cloister had been once the home of St. Thomas Aquinas, whose words Bruno claimed at his trial he had always by him, continually reading, studying, and restudying them and holding them dear. This was the age when efforts to put down every heresy had been redoubled. The fanaticism of Loyola and the decision of the Council of Trent to erase with fire and sword the slightest traces of heresy made a poor framework in which to place a picture of the liberal-minded scholar. Bruno soon learned this at his cost. Even during his novitiate, he was accused of giving away images of the saints and of giving bad advice to his associates. In 1576 he was accused of apologizing for the heresy of Arius, that the Son was begotten of the Father, and so not consubstantial nor coeternal with him, but created by him and subordinate to him, which was condemned by the Council of Nice 325 and contradicted in the Nicene Creed, admiring its scholastic form rather than its abstract truth. Disgusted with his treatment, he left Naples and went to Rome. Even here he was molested in the cloister of Minerva, note the pagan name, and was met with an accusation of 130 specifications. He then abandoned his garb and his cloister and escaped from Rome, beginning thus the nomadic life which he continued until immured in the dungeons of the Inquisition at Venice, 16 years later. Through these wanderings one must follow him if one would become familiar with his life and traits. He now resumed for a time his baptismal name, and traveled to a town on the Gulf of Genoa, where he taught youth and young gentlemen. Then he passed on to Turin and Venice, where he spent weeks in futile attempts to find work, but the schools and the printing houses were closed because of the plague. In Venice, however, he managed to print his first book on the signs of the times, or rather, this was the first book to appear in print. It seems that before he left Naples he wrote The Ark of Noah, a satirical allegory. In this he represented that the animals held a formal meeting in the ark to settle questions of precedence and rank, and the presiding officer, the ass, was in danger of losing his position and his influence, because the power lay rather in hooves than horns. Throughout most of his life, Bruno constantly scored and criticized docility. It was frequently the topic of his invective, and those who read between the lines were probably quite justified in regarding these frequent allusions as references to the ignorance, bigotry, and credulity of the monks. From Venice, Bruno went to Padua, where some of the Dominican friars persuaded him to resume monastic costume, since it made travel easier and safer. Thence, by way of Brescia and Milan, he may be followed to Bergamo. At Milan, he first heard of his future friend Sir Philip Sidney. From Bergamo, he resolved to go to Lyon, but learning that he would find anything but welcome there, he turned aside and crossed the Alps, arriving in Geneva in the spring of 1579. Here he was visited by a distinguished Neapolitan exile, the Marquis de Vico, who persuaded him again to lay aside his clerical garb, and who gave him the dress of a gentleman, including a sword. Here is raised the great question: did Bruno adopt Calvinism? Before the Inquisition 15 years later, he practically denied this, yet acknowledged attending the lectures of Balbini, of Lucca, as well as others who taught and preached in Geneva. Under the regulations of the Academy, University, where he had already registered, certain regulations must be complied with, and Bruno appears to have obeyed them in at least a certain degree, but the immediate cause for his departure from Geneva appears to have been one of his outbreaks of cynicism and accurate scholarship, since in 1579 he was called before the council for having caused to be printed a document enumerating 20 errors made by the professor of philosophy, de la Fay, in one of his lectures. The latter was incensed and outraged at this criticism and disparagement of his views and learning, and the quarrel assumed unexpected magnitude, since Bruno, on his second appearance before the consistory or supreme tribunal of the church, denied the charges and called the ministers pedagogues. These gentlemen decided to refuse him communion unless he should confess and repent of his faults and make due apology. His acceptance of these conditions not being hearty enough to suit his judges, he was admonished and excluded from the communion. These steps led to greater contrition on his part, and the ban of excommunication was withdrawn. This sentence of exclusion was the only one within the power of the consistory to pass, but does not prove that Bruno had accepted the Protestant faith nor partaken of its communion. In fact, at his trial he steadfastly denied this. It seemed, however, to disgust him with Calvinism, against which thereafter he never ceased to inveigh. Later he contrasted it with Lutheranism, which was far more tolerant, and still later gave him a heartier welcome. Calvin, it must be remembered, had written a polemic against Servetus, in which it is shown to be lawful to coerce heretics by the sword. As between the Council of Trent and Calvin, it certainly must have been hard in those days to select either a faith or an abiding place that faith might be peaceably practiced. Doubtless Bruno's views concerning the philosophy of Aristotle conflicted with those of the church authorities, for Beza, Calvin's follower, had stated that they did not propose to swerve one particle from the opinions of that Greek philosopher, to whom, though of pagan origin, the church, both Roman and Protestant, was for centuries so firmly bound. And so, shaking the dust of Geneva from his feet, he journeyed to Lyons, where he failed utterly to find occupation, and then to Toulouse, where he remained about 2 years. Here he took a doctorate in theology, in order to compete for a vacant chair. To this he was elected by the students, as the custom then was in most of the scholia or universities. For 2 sessions he lectured on Aristotle. Had this university required of him that he should attend Mass, as did some others, he could not have done so, owing to his excommunication. Though just why exclusion from a Calvinistic academy should debar him from Catholic Mass does not appear. Toulouse was a warm place for heretics. The burning of 14,000 of them at its capture will prove this. A few years, 35 after he left it, Vanini was burned for heretic notions. It is hardly to be believed that Bruno could pass 2 years or more here without controversies arising from his teaching. But the nominal reason for leaving in 1581 and going to Paris was the war then raging in southern France under Henry of Navarre. Before leaving Toulouse he completed his Clavis Magna, or Great Key, the last word, as he seemed to think, on the art of memory. Only one volume of this great work, which in his peculiarly egotistical way he said is superlatively pregnant, was ever published, and that in England, the Sigillus Sigillorum. It must not be forgotten that it was on both teaching and practicing this art of memory that Bruno, throughout his career, prided himself. He was even not averse, at least in certain periods of his career, to the belief that he had some secret system for this purpose, or even received occult aid. But when summoned before Henry III, to whose ears had come his fame, and asked whether the memory he had and the art he professed were natural or due to magic, he proved that a good memory was a cultivated natural product. He then dedicated to the king a book on the art of memory. But this was shortly after his arrival in Paris, in 1581, where he quickly became famous. A course of 30 lectures on the 30 divine attributes of St. Thomas Aquinas would have given him a chair, could he have attended Mass. His residence in Paris was marked by an extraordinary literary activity. He published in succession De Umbri Idearum, Shadow of Ideas, dedicated to Henry III. This included the art of memory just mentioned. Cantus Circaeus, Incantation of Circe, dedicated to Prince Henry. De Compendiosa Architectura et Complemento Artis Luli, Compendious Architecture. Il Candelaio, The Torchbearer. These all appeared in 1582. These varied greatly in character. The first was devoted to the metaphysics of the art of remembering, with an analysis of that faculty, and the second was given to the same general topic. It was all obscure, hence perhaps its popularity. Brunhofer says that it was a convenient means of introducing Bruno to strange universities, gaining him favor with the great, or helping him out of pressing need of money. It was his exoteric philosophy with which he could carefully drape the philosophy of a religion hostile to the church and ride as a hobby horse in his unfruitful humors. Nevertheless, we must believe in his sincerity. The Compendious Architecture is the first of his works in which Bruno deals with the views of Raymond Lully, a logical calculus and mnemonic scheme in one that had many imitators. For Lully, Bruno seemed to have the greatest regard, disappearing in many ways. Lully, by the way, was a Spanish scholastic and alchemist who was born on one of the Balearic Islands in 1235. He went as a missionary to the Mohammedans and spent much time in Asia and Africa. He figures largely in the history of the alchemists and as a practitioner of the occult. The Torchbearer was a work of very different character. It was described as a comedy by one who described himself as Academico di nulla academia dido il fastidito intristiti hilaris hilaritate tristis. It is essentially a satire on the predominant vices of pedantry, superstition, and selfishness, or sordid love. Though lacking in dramatic power, it is regarded as second to nothing of its kind in time. Its dramatis personae are personified types, not individuals. It was realistic even in its vulgarity, for obscenity was prevalent in the literature of those days. But in it Bruno struck at what seemed to him his greatest enemy, i.e., pedantry. There were at this time in Paris two great universities. One the College de France, with liberal tendencies and opposed to the Jesuits and all pedantry; the other the Sorbonne, for centuries the guardian of the Catholic faith, endowed with the right of censorship which must have been exercised over Bruno's works. In which of these, though surely in one of them, Bruno was made an extraordinary lecturer, history has failed to record. He must have offended both, since he was anxious to be taken back into the Church, yet was revolutionary in his teaching. More than 30 years later Nostitz, one of his pupils, paid tribute to his versatility and skill, saying, "He was able to discourse impromptu on any suggested topic, to speak extensively and elaborately without preparation, so that he attracted many pupils and admirers in Paris." But Bruno belonged to the literary peripatetic school, and in 1583 he forsook Paris for London, because, as he says of tumults, leaving it to the imagination whether these were civil or scholastic. Elizabeth reigned at this time. Her influence made England a harbor of safety for religious and other mental suspects. She had a penchant for Italians and their language. Two of her physicians were Italians, and Florio was ever welcome at her court. To this court Bruno was also welcomed, and basking for some time in the sunshine of her regard and patronage, passed there the happiest portion of his unhappy life. Oxford was at that time the stronghold of Aristotelianism. One of its statutes ordained that bachelors and masters who did not follow Aristotle faithfully were liable to a fine of 5 shillings for every point of divergence, and one for every fault committed against the logic of the Organon. In Oxford at this time, unfortunately, theology was the only live issue. Of science as of real scholarship there was little or none. Its predominant trait of those days is still, perhaps, its dominant feature today. To this university Bruno addressed a letter, couched in vainglorious and egotistical terms, craving permission to lecture there. This was not received with favor, while his doctrines met with small encouragement at this ancient seat of learning, which Bruno later stigmatized as the window of true science. But opportunity was afforded him to dispute publicly before a noble visitor in June 1583, a Polish prince, one Alasco, for whom great public entertainment had been provided. His opponent, defeated by 15 unanswerable syllogisms, resorted to scurrility and abuse. This public exhibition put an end to lectures on the immortality of the soul which Bruno had been allowed to give, and he returned to London. Shortly after this he published his Cena, Ash Wednesday Supper, in which he ridiculed the Oxford doctors, saying, among other things, that they were much better acquainted with beer than with the Greek. But he criticized too cynically, and lost thereby in popularity. This led to the appearance of the Causa, a dialogue in which he was less vindictive. He admitted in this that there was much in the old institution that was admirable, that it was even the first in Europe, that speculative philosophy first flourished there, and that thence the splendor of one of the noblest and rarest spheres of philosophy in our times, almost extinct, was diffused to all other academies in civilized lands. What he most condemned was the too great attention given to language and words, while the realistics for which words stand were neglected. Doctors were easily made and doctorates too cheaply bought. His charge in brief was that they mistook the shadows for the substance, a charge even yet too commonly justified among the strongholds of theology and other speculative dogmas. Returning to London after this experience, Bruno went to live with Mauvissier, the French ambassador. While the English records make no mention of his presence, it is yet quite certain that he was frequently at court, and that men like Sidney, Greville, Temple, and others were his frequent associates. But as the ambassador's influence was on the wane, he was not equal to his great trust. At this time our philosopher spoke of himself as one whom the foolish hate, the ignoble despise, whom the wise love, the learned admire, etc. Macintyre. Of Queen Elizabeth he wrote in the most fulsome phrases, such as she too dearly loved. Before his judges a few years later, Bruno apologized for his exaggerated expressions concerning a Protestant ruler, claiming that when he spoke of her as divine, he meant it not as a term of worship, but as an epithet, like those which the ancients bestow upon their rulers. claiming further that he knew he erred in thus praising a heretic. Bruno published 7 works in England. The first was Explicatio Triginta Sigillorum, the 30 seals thus explained being hints and acquired, arranging and remembering all arts and sciences. To it was added his Sigillus Sigillorum for comparing and explaining all mental operations. Then came an Italian dialogue, La Cena della Cineri, or Ash Wednesday Supper. This was written in praise and extension of the Copernican theory, indeed quite exceeding it in teaching the identity of matter, the infinity of the universe, the possibility of life on other spheres, with a painstaking attempt to show that these notions do not conflict with those of Mother Church. Next came De Causa, Principio et Uno, cause, principle, and unity. This treated of the immanence of spirit, the eternity of matter, the potential divinity of life, the origin of sin and death, and many other abstruse topics. It was followed by De l'Infinito Universo ed Mundi, with numerous reasons for believing the universe to be infinite and full of innumerable worlds, with the divine essence everywhere pervading. All these works appeared in 1583. In 1584 appeared his Spazio della Bestia Trionfante, or Expulsion of the Triumphant Beast. In this prose poem Jupiter, repenting his errors, resolved to expel the many beasts that occupy his heavenly sphere, the constellations, and to substitute for them the virtues. In the council of the gods convened by his many subjects are discussed, among them the history of religions, the contrast between natural and revealed religions, and the fundamental forms of mortality. In this allegory Jupiter represents, of course, the human spirit. The bear, the scorpion, etc., are the vices to be expelled. Unfortunately, the book was quite generally regarded as an attack upon the Church or the Pope, though what he really struck at was the credulity of mankind. It was dedicated to Sir Philip Sidney. Then came his Cabala del Cavallo Pegasio, or Cabal, dedicated to a supposititious bishop who was made to impersonate the spirit of ignorance and sloth. It was a mordant satire on asininity, including credulity and unquestioning faith. After this he dedicated another work to Sidney, Degli Eroici Furori, Enthusiasms of the Noble, a collection of sonnets with prose commentaries, like Dante's Vita Nuova, touching on the love for spiritual beauty arising from that for physical beauty attaining a climax in a sort of ecstasy by union with the divine. These sonnets possess a very high literary value aside from their other interest. When his ambassadorial patron was recalled, Bruno probably returned to Paris with him, during the latter part of 1585. Here he spent a year amidst constant turmoil and excitement, and at his own expense. Though he attempted reconciliation with the Church, he was regarded as an apostate. He held one more public disputation in which he advanced 120 theses against the teaching of the Sorbonne, his side being taken by its rival, the College de France. The outcome cannot have been brilliantly favorable, since he soon after left Paris in June 1586. The collection of charges above alluded to was published in Paris after Bruno's departure, and again in Wittenberg under the title Excubador, the Ambassador. It was an arraignment of the Aristotelians, based on the words of that great master himself. Bruno claimed the same right to criticize Aristotle that the latter claimed to criticize his predecessors. In it Bruno says, "It is a poor mind that will think with the multitude because it is a multitude. Truth is not altered by the opinions of the vulgar or the confirmation of the many." And again, "It is more blessed to be wise in truth in face of opinion than be wise in opinion in face of truth." In addition to this, Bruno had also published, before leaving Paris, a commentary on the physics of Aristotle. Tarrying somewhat by the wayside, Bruno reached Wittenberg, where in 1586 he matriculated at its university, Marburg having curtly rejected him. Describing him here, MacIntyre styles him the knight-errant of philosophy. Here Lutheranism dominated the theological faculty, while the philosophical faculty was dominated by Calvinism. Views concerning the person of Christ, the real presence, and the doctrine of predestination keeping them apart in spite of Melanchthon's attempt to reunite the two factions. From the Lutheran party Bruno obtained permission to lecture, and so for 2 years he taught from the Oranon of Aristotle, as well as writings of Raymond Lully. To the University Senate he dedicated a work on Lully, De Lampade Combinatoria Lulliana, whose chief purpose was to teach one how to find an indefinite number of propositions and middle terms for speaking and arguing. He regarded it as the only key to the Lullian writings, as well as a clue to a great many of the mysteries of the Pythagoreans and Kabbalists. It was soon followed by De Progressu et Lampare Venitoria Logicorum, intended to enable one to dispute promptly and copiously on any subject. But again fate compelled a change of residence, for the Calvinistic and Ducal party gained in political ascendancy, to which Bruno, as a Copernican, would have appeared as a heretic. After delivering an eloquent address of farewell he moved on, his next abiding place being Prague, where Rudolf II of Bohemia was posing as the friend of all learned men. Here he already had friends at court, and here he introduced himself with another Lullian work. To the emperor he next dedicated a work of iconoclast type, 160 articles against the mathematicians and philosophers of the day. For this the emperor granted him the sum of $300, and in January 1589 he shifted again to Helmstadt in Brunswick, where he matriculated again in the then youngest of the German universities. This has been founded only 12 years before by Duke Julius, who was extremely liberal in his views and intended to found a model institution in which theology should not play too dominant a part. But while he received here a certain recognition, fate again sported with him, for the Duke died 4 months after his arrival. Bruno obtained permission to pronounce a funeral oration, desiring to express his gratitude to the memory of one who had opened such an institution, so free to all lovers of the muses and exiles like himself, who were here protected from the greedy maw of the Roman wolf, whereas in Italy he had been chained to a superstitious cult. It was full of allusions to the papal tyranny which was infecting the world with the rankest poison of ignorance and vice. The fatuous simplicity and worldly blindness which Bruno displayed in ever setting foot inside of Italian or papal territory after the delivery of this Oratio Consolatoria may in one way be appreciated, but never understood or explained. Moreover, he had made himself persona non grata as well to the Protestants, who were scarcely more liberal than the Catholics. It appears that the great Bathius, superintendent of the Church of Helmstadt, had acted both as judge and executioner, and publicly excommunicated Bruno without a hearing, since there is extant a letter appealing for his arbitrary judgment and malice. The grounds for this judgment were never made clear, since no attention was ever paid to the appeal. But inasmuch as Bruno never really joined the Protestant profession, it must be meant to inflict some species of social ostracism. Bathius had himself to be suppressed later. But Bruno, finding too many enemies, left for Frankfurt in 1590, in order to get 2 books printed. These were his 2 great Latin works, De Minimo and De Minso, the introduction to the latter being the De Monade. He worked at these with his own hands. In the introduction to the former his publisher stated that before its final revision, Bruno had been hurriedly called away by an unforeseen chance. This sudden departure may have been due to a refusal of the town council to permit his residence there, or it may have been a call to Zurich, where he spent a few months with one Heinzel, who had a leaning toward the black arts. Bruno wrote for him De Imaginum Compositione, a manual of his art of memory. In this Swiss city he also dedicated a work Summa Terminorum Metaphysicorum, which was not published until 1609, and then in Marburg. But Bruno returned to Frankfurt in 1591, where he obtained permission to publish his De Minimo. This work was on the threefold minimum and measurement, being the elements of 3 speculative and several practical sciences. This, like the 2 next mentioned, was a Latin poem, after the fashion of Lucretius. The De Monade, Numero et Figura, dealt with the monad, and with the elements of a more esoteric science, while in the De Minso et Innumerabilibus, the immeasurable and innumerable, he dealt with the universe and the worlds. These 3 poems contain Bruno's complete philosophy of God and nature. While thus staying in Frankfurt for the second time, Bruno was invited by a young Venetian patrician to pay him a visit, and became his tutor in those arts in which the philosopher excelled. It was the most unfortunate event in Bruno's unhappy life when he accepted this apparently tempting invitation. Mocenigo, his host, was of good family, but shallow, vain, weak-minded, and dishonest, with the fashionable taste of his day for the black arts. It is quite possible that he was moreover the tool of the Inquisition, which had long desired to entrap Bruno. It is probable, moreover, that the latter quite failed to appreciate how unenviable he was regarded by that church, to which he still felt that he belonged. Furthermore, Venice was then a republic and free, and he longed for his beloved Italy again. En route to Venice, he spent 3 months in Padua, teaching there and gathering around himself pupils, even in that short time. He had barely left it when Galileo was invited there to teach. As Rayo has said, the creator of modern science following in the steps of its prophet. Early in 1592, Bruno went to live in Mocenigo's house. Trouble soon began. Entirely apart in temperament and characteristics, they soon disagreed. The pupil was deeply disappointed at not acquiring that mastery over the secrets of nature for which he had hoped, and found that there was no quick way to acquire a retentive and replete memory. And so, Mocenigo announced to his friend Sciotto, the bookseller, his intent to gain from Bruno all he could, and then denounce him to the Holy Office. While others were thus conspiring against him, Bruno was writing a book on the 7 liberal arts, and on 7 other inventive arts, intending to present it to the Pope, hoping thus to obtain absolution and be released from the ban of excommunication. When Bruno at last appreciated the dangers by which he was surrounded, he announced his intent to go again to Frankfurt, to have some of his books printed, and so took his leave of Mocenigo. On the following day in May 1592, Bruno was seized by 6 men using force, who locked him in an upper story of Mocenigo's house. The next day he was transferred to an underground cellar, and the following night to the prison of the Inquisition. May 23rd, his former host denounced him, with a cunning and lying statement concerning some of his views and teachings. Thus he was reported as stating that Christ's miracles were only apparent, and he and the apostles were magicians, that the Catholic faith was full of blasphemies against God, that the friars befouled the world and should not be allowed to preach, that they were asses, and that doctrines of church were asses' beliefs, etc. This was followed 2 days later by a second denunciation in which Mocenigo went to a diabolical extreme of deceit and hypocrisy, stating that all the time he was entertaining Bruno, he was promising himself to bring him before the Holy Office. Within 48 hours the Holy Tribunal met to consider the matter. Before them appeared the booksellers who had known Bruno in Zurich and Frankfurt, and before them came Bruno in his own behalf, professing his entire willingness to tell the whole truth. Within a few days, Mocenigo made yet another deposition, denouncing Bruno's statements about the infallible Church. On the following day, Bruno was again heard in his own defense, and appealed to the famous and fallacious doctrine of twofold truth, acknowledging that he had taught too much as a philosopher rather than as an honest man and Christian, and that he had based his teachings too much on sense and reason, and not enough on faith. So specious had become his argument with the terrors of the Inquisition before him. He further claimed that his intent had been not to impugn his faith, but to exalt philosophy. He then beautifully epitomized his own views, claiming that he believed in an infinite universe, in an infinite divine potency, holding it unworthy of an infinite power to create a finite world, when he could produce so vast an infinity. With Pythagoras, he regarded this world as one of many stars, innumerable worlds. The universe he held to be governed by a universal providence, existent in 2 forms: one nature, the shadow or footprint of deity; the other, the ineffable essence of God, always inexplicable. Concerning the triune Godhead, he confessed certain philosophic doubts, as well as concerning the use of the term persons in these distinctions, while he quoted St. Augustine to the same effect. The miracles he had always believed to be divine and genuine. Concerning the Holy Mass and the transubstantiation, he agreed with the Church. As the days went by, he became more insistent upon his orthodoxy. He condemned the heretic writings of Melanchthon, Luther, and Calvin, expressed respect for the writings of Lully because of their philosophical bearings, while for St. Thomas Aquinas he had the most profound regard. Other counts in the indictment which he had to face were his doubts concerning the miracles, the sacraments, and the Incarnation, his praise of heretics and heretic princes, and his familiarity with the magic arts. He finally made a formal solemn abjuration of all the errors he ever committed, and the heresies he ever uttered, or doubted, or doubts expressed or believed, praying only that the Holy Office would receive him back into the Church where he might rest in peace. Further examinations were held, and the earlier processes against him in Naples and Rome recalled. After this there was a period of apparent quiet, save that he remained in prison. It is not known to what tortures he may have been subjected, but it is recorded that he knelt before his judges asking their pardon, and God's, for all of his faults, and professed himself ready for any penance, apparently not yet realizing the fate in store for him. A little later it transpired that the sacred congregation of the Supreme Tribunal of the Holy Office in Rome desired to assume all further responsibilities for the process against so distinguished a heretic. Accordingly, the machinery of the Church was put in motion to this end. Negotiations with the Venetian Republic, somewhat tedious and complicated, which need not detain us now, were at last concluded. January 7th, 1603, the Venetian procurator reported of Bruno that his faults were exceedingly grave in respect of heresies, though in other respects he was one of the most excellent and rarest natures, and of exquisite learning and knowledge. But that the case was of unusual gravity, Bruno not a Venetian subject, the Pope most anxious, etc. It was then decided to remit him to the tribunal of the Inquisition at Rome, whereat it is duly reported the Pope was deeply gratified. To Rome then he went, and here he was lost, so far as documentary records go, for a period of 6 years. How to explain this fact, and this apparent clemency, has bothered the biographers not a little. Whether this time was spent in an examination of his voluminous writings, which would seem incredible, or whether the Dominicans labored so long to procure his more absolute recantation in order to prevent scandal in and reflection on their order, or whether Pope Clement himself regarded kindly, in some degree, the great scholar who was so anxious to dedicate to him a magnum opus. To these queries history answereth not. The Dominicans pretended, years later, to doubt if he ever had been put to death, or whether he had ever really belonged to their order. These statements are too characteristic to provoke more than a sad smile. Finally, matters were hastened to an end by the efforts of Fathers Commissario and Bellarmino, the latter being the zealot bigot who decided that Copernicanism was a heresy, who later laid the indictment against Galileo. Through their machinations, Bruno was, in February 1599, decreed on 8 counts as a dangerous heretic, who might still admit his heresies, and he was to be granted 40 days in which to recant and repent. But this period was stretched out some 10 months, until December, when it was reported that Bruno refused to recant, having nothing to take back. Among the tribunal at this time was San Severino, fanatical, bitter because of his failure to secure the papacy, who had declared that St. Bartholomew's was a glorious day, a day of joy for the Catholics. It was decided that the high officers of the Dominicans should make one last effort to compel or coax Bruno to abjure. This he declined to do. Whereupon January 20th, 1600, it was decreed that further measures be proceeded to servatus servandis, that sentence be passed, and that the said friar Giordano be handed over to the secular authority. A few days later Bruno was degraded, excommunicated, and handed over to the governor of Rome, with the usual hypocritical recommendation to mercy, and that he be punished without effusion of blood, which meant, of course, burning at the stake. Bruno's reply to his judges deserves to be printed in letters of gold wherever it can be recorded. Greater, perhaps, is your fear in pronouncing my sentence than mine in hearing it. Let us spare ourselves a too minute account of his execution. Some reports are to the effect that his tongue was tied because he refused to listen to the exhortations of those members of the Company of St. John the Beheaded, better known as the Brothers of the Misericordia, who accompanied the condemned to the scaffold or the stake, resorting to the most cruel methods in order to provoke at least some appearance of recantation or repentance during their last moments of life. Right here let it be said of Bruno, that whatever may have been his weaknesses before the Inquisition at Venice, he stood firmly by his creed when put to the final test, and died an ideal martyr's death, because his creed did not agree with that of his persecutors. And so terminated the life of one of Italy's greatest ornaments and scholars. The occasion had not then the importance we assign it now. The burning of a heretic was a frequent spectacle, and the year 1600 was the year of Jubilee, in which the death of one unbeliever more was but the incident of a day. He had himself foreseen it, saying, "Torches, 50 or 100, will not fail me, even though the march past be at midday, should it be my fate to die in Roman Catholic country." There remains yet to comment on his character and to analyze his views. The greatest blot upon the former is his attitude before the Venetian tribunal. Here he was at first defiant, even polemical, strong in his asserted right to use the natural light of sense and reason. Under greater stress he modified this to one of absolute and indignant denial, and finally became submissive to the last degree, cringing and finally begging for pardon on bended knees. That this attitude changed with his better realization of his predicament is undeniable. Moreover, what keen and sensitive natures may do under the influence of torture is never to be predicated. How many of us could resist the persuasiveness of the rack when it came to modifying our beliefs? But whatever may have been his weakness at that time, he completely rehabilitated himself before his end. For were not his ashes scattered to the winds as a token that he completely failed to recant? Surely no martyr to science or dogma ever died a more dignified death for the edification or example of others. What shall be said of his persecutors and prosecutors? Let us here be charitable. Let us be just. Have we yet that absolute knowledge of right or wrong which can enable us to pass final judgment on men of the past, their motives and actions? Moral perceptions are the product of the race, the age, and the environment. They vary greatly with times. There is no crime, in or out of the Decalogue, which has at all times and by all peoples been regarded as such. The Church during several centuries enjoyed a monopoly of wisdom or learning as well as the opportunities for acquiring them. Zealotry, bigotry, intolerance, fanaticism were the natural products of such conditions. So were cruelty and disregard of human life. Join the mind of a bigot to the body of one who knows not fear, and the result will be a Loyola, or a St. Louis of France, who held that the only argument a layman should engage in with a heretic should be the sword thrust through the body. If then heresy was a crime, punishable by a cruel death in all the capitals of Europe, let us blame less the men who were trained and grew up with these notions, but rather more the Church which preached them, whether Catholic or Protestant. Only if one of these really were, as it still claims to be, infallible, then what has become of its infallibility? Or if heresy be held still a crime, then what shall we say of the Church's ethics? If one were God-given, the other is unchristlike. But no free thinker can engage in theological polemics, or with Jesuitical sophistries, without letting his reason excite his emotions. And when the emotions enter the door, logic flies out the window. Let us say then that Bruno was in some respects so far ahead of his day and generation that they understood him not. And yet he was a torchbearer, save at his own last funeral pyre, shedding forth a light which illuminated the centuries to come, and helping to make the period of the Italian Renaissance one of the most important and glorious in the world's history. If better known and more widely studied, he would be by English and American students placed on that pinnacle which he deserves in the Hall of Fame. What shall be said of Bruno as a philosopher? He, first of all men in the Middle Ages, taught that nature was lovable and worthy of study. Loving her, trusting, confiding in her, he found himself at outs with the mental processes of his fellow scholars. In this way, the natural method was brought into direct opposition with the ponderously artificial and strained methods of his day. He held that our eyes were given us that we might open and look upward. Seeing, I do not pretend not to see, nor fear to profess it openly, he says. His philosophy was rather a product of intuition than of ratiocination, which became his real religion, for which Catholicism was a cloak, because in those days one was compelled to wear a cloak, or live but a short life, and that within prison walls. What the medieval church, Catholic or even Protestant, has to answer for, as to the suppression of truth and provocation of hypocrisy, is beyond the menstruation of man. For the argument from authority he had the greatest contempt, and herein he set the world of thinkers a valuable lesson. To believe with the many, because they were many, was the mark of a slave. Before Bacon, even Descartes, he saw the necessity of first clearing the mind of all prejudice, all traditional beliefs that rest on authority. He thus begins one of his sonnets. O holy asininity! O holy ignorance! Holy folly and pious devotion, which alone make his soul so good that human wit and zeal can go no further, etc. By the independence of his own mental processes, he was thrown quite upon his own resources, and his nature, already dignified and reserved, was made more introspective and self-conscious. In this way he developed strains of vanity and egotism, which led him at times to the bombastic self-laudation of a Paracelsus. He had nothing but disgust for the common people and the sort of scholars, pedants, whom they admired. The vulgar mind was more influenced by sophisms, by appearance, by failure to distinguish between the shadow and the substance. Take but 2 or 3 of Bruno's conceptions. He perhaps first during the Middle Ages taught the transformation of lower into higher organisms, following the Greeks who first enunciated the doctrine of evolution, which it remained for Darwin and Wallace to edit and illustrate as that law of organic continuity of life which we call evolution. He further wrote of the human hand as a factor in the evolution of the human race, in a way which should have commended him to the author of the Bridgewater Treatise. He wrote of changes on the earth's surface, brought about by the natural processes, which have changed not only the external configuration of the same, but the fate and destiny of nations, of the identity of matter throughout the universe, of the universal movement of matter. Long before Lessing, he showed how myths may contain the germs of great truths, and should be regarded as indications thereof. In this way he told us the Bible was to be regarded, holding its more or less historical statements to be quite subordinate to its moral teachings. When we realize how to such highly developed reasoning powers, as Bruno possessed, were added a phenomenal memory, a tremendous power of assimilation, a developed imagination, a poetic nature, the gift of easy and articulate speech, and a temperament easily excited to fervor in attack or defense, we may the better appreciate his dominating greatness, as well as his trifling weaknesses, the former being entirely to his own credit, while the latter are ascribed largely to the faults of his time, and the fact that he was really living far ahead of his day and generation. He was not only the forerunner of modern science, he was the prototype of the modern biblical critic, foreshadowing the modern higher criticism, albeit in veiled forms. And as a matter of esoteric teaching, because the biblical critic of those days was burned at the stake, while today he's barely ostracized by the shallow and narrow-minded, with whom he has at best nothing mentally in common. So much have 4 centuries of labor and vicarious suffering accomplished for the emancipation of the human mind. Bruno had a creed, but it was too simple for his times. He rejected certain orthodox dogmas, e.g. the Trinity, the Immaculate Conception, which commend themselves still less to the emancipated and cultivated minds of today. He absolutely rejected authority, which was a step towards reason comparable to the freeing of the slaves or serfs. He evolved a theory of evolution from a priori concepts, which it remained for Darwin to complete and demonstrate. He believed that the essence of truth inhered in those differences which kept men apart, and still severed them. He believed the law of love, and that it sprang from God, which is the Father of all, that it was in harmony with nature, and that by love we may be transformed into something of His likeness. As Bruno himself says, "This is the religion, above controversy or dispute, which I observe from the belief of my own mind, and from the custom of my fatherland and my race." And yet this sublime man was burned as a heretic. Let us stop, when we hereafter pass through the Campo dei Fiori, as I have done many a time, and take off our hats to the memory of this great man, who, while small in some human traits, yet was the greatest thinker in Italy during the 16th century, whose memory may help us to forget some of the hypocrisies that were generally prevalent during the age which, and among the men who condemned him. Let us also thank God that there is no tribunal of the Inquisition today, to pass misguided judgment upon us for having gone further than Bruno ever dreamed, though along the same lines, and to condemn us, therefore, to the flames. This paper has already been prolonged, perhaps tiresomely. Nevertheless, I cannot refrain from quoting a few paragraphs from the most versatile student of this period, Symonds, whose estimate of Bruno is as follows. Bruno appears before us as the man who most vitally and comprehensively grasped the leading tendencies of his age in their intellectual essence. He left behind him the medieval conception of an extra-mundane God, creating a finite world of which this globe is the center, and the principal episode in the history of which is the series of events from the fall, through the incarnation and crucifixion, to the last judgment. He substantiated the conception of an ever-living, ever-acting, ever self-effectuating God, immanent in an infinite universe, to the contemplation of whose attributes the mind of man ascends by the study of nature and interrogation of his conscience. Bolder even than Copernicus, and nearer in his intuition to the truth, he denied that the universe had flaming walls, or any walls at all, that immaginata circonferenza, quella margine immaginata del cielo, on which antique science and Christian theology alike reposed, was the object of his ceaseless satire, his oft-repeated polemic. What, then, rendered Bruno the precursor of modern thought in its various manifestations, was that he grasped the fundamental truth upon which modern science rests, and foresaw the conclusions which must be drawn from it. He speculated boldly, incoherently, vehemently, but he speculated with a clear conception of the universe, as we still apprehend it. Through this course of 3 centuries, we have been engaged in verifying the guesses, deepening, broadening, and solidifying the hypotheses, which Bruno's extension of the Copernican theory and his application of it to pure thought suggested to his penetrating and audacious intellect. Bruno was convinced that religion in its higher essence would not suffer from the new philosophy. Larger horizons extended before the human intellect. The soul expanded in more exhilarating regions than the old theologies had offered. Lift up thy light on us, and on thine own, O soul whose spirit on earth was as a rod, to scourge off priests, a sword to pierce their God. A staff for man's free thought to walk alone, a lamp to lead him far from shrine and throne. On ways untrodden, where his fathers trod, eerie earth's heart withered at a high priest's nod. And all men's mouths that made not prayer made moan, from bonds and torments and the ravening flame, surely thy spirit of sense rose up to greet Lucretius, where such only spirits meet, and walk with him apart till Shelley came, to make the heaven of heavens more heavenly sweet, and mix with yours a third incorporate name. The Heretic, L. Williams. Nola, a city founded by the Chalcidian Greeks at a short distance from Naples and from Vesuvius, was the birthplace of Giordano Bruno. It is described by David Levi as a city from which ancient times had always been consecrated to science and letters. From the time of the Romans to that of the barbarians and of the Middle Ages, Nola was conspicuous for culture and refinement, and its inhabitants were in all times remarkable for their courteous manners, for valor, and for keenness of perception. They were, moreover, distinguished by their love for and study of philosophy, so that this city was ever a favorite dwelling place for the choice spirits of the Renaissance. It may also be asserted that Nola was the only city of the Magna Graecia which, in spite of the persecutions of pagan emperors and Christian princes and clergy, always preserved the philosophical traditions of the Pythagoreans, and never was the sacred fire on the altar of Vesta suffered to become entirely extinct. Such was the intellectual and moral atmosphere in which Bruno passed his childhood. His paternal home was situated at the foot of Mount Cicada, celebrated for its fruitful soil. From early youth his pleasure was to pass the night out on the mountain, now watching the stars, now contemplating the Erid. His paternal home was situated at the foot of Mount Cicada, celebrated for its fruitful soil. From early youth his pleasure was to pass the night out on the mountain, now watching the stars, now contemplating the arid, desolate sides of Vesuvius. He tells how, in recalling those days, the only peaceful ones of his life, he used to think, as he looked up at the infinite expanse of heaven and the confines of the horizon with the towering volcano, that this must be the ultimate end of the earth. And it appeared as if neither tree nor grass refreshed the dreary space which stretched out to the foot of the bare, smoky mountain. When, grown older, he came nearer to it, and saw the mountain so different from what it had appeared, and the intervening space that, seen from afar, had looked so bare and sterile, all covered with fruit trees and enriched with vineyards, he began to see how illusory the judgment of the senses may be, and the first doubt was planted in his young soul as he perceived that, while the mind may grasp nature in her grandeur and majesty, the work of the sage must be to examine her in detail, and penetrate to the cause of things, When he appeared before the tribunal of the Holy Office at Venice, being asked to declare who and what he was, he said, "My name is Giordano, of the family of Bruno, of the city of Nola, 12 miles from Naples. There was I born and brought up. My profession has been and is that of letters, and of all the sciences. My father's name was Giovanni, my mother was Francesca Savellini, and my father was a soldier. He is dead, and also mother. I am 44 years old, having been born in 1548. He always regarded Nola with patriotic pride, and he received his first instruction in his father's house and in the public schools. Of a sad disposition and gifted with a mostly lively imagination, he was from his earliest years given to meditation and to poetry. The early years of Bruno's life were times of agitation and misfortune, and not propitious to study. The Neapolitan provinces were distributed by constant earthquakes, and devastated by pestilence and famine. The Turks fought and ravaged the country, and made slaves of the inhabitants. The neighboring provinces were still more harassed by hordes of bandits and outlaws, who invested Calabria, led by a terrible chief called Marcone. The Inquisition stood prepared to light its fires and slaughter the heretic. The Waldensians, who had lately been driven out of Piedmont, and had sought a shelter in the Calabrian territory, were hunted down and given over to the executioner. The convent was the only refuge from violence, and Bruno, either from religious enthusiasm or in order to be able to devote himself to study, became a friar at the age of 15. There, in the quiet cloister of the convent of St. Dominic at Naples, his mind was nourished and his intellect developed. The cloister and monkish education failed to enslave his thought, and he emerged from this tutelage the boldest and least fettered of philosophers. Everything about this church and this convent, famous as having been the abode of Thomas Aquinas, was calculated to fire the enthusiasm of Bruno's soul. The leisure and the quiet, far from inducing habits of indolence or the sterile practices of asceticism, were stimulants to austere study, and to the fervor of mystical speculations. Here he passed nearly 13 years of early manhood, until his intellect strengthened by study he began to long for independence of thought, and becoming, as he said to himself, solicitous about the food of the soul and the culture of the mind, he found it irksome to go through automatically the daily vulgar routine of the convent, the pure flame of an elevated religious feeling being kindled in his soul. He tried to evade the vain exercises of the monks, the puerile gymnastics, and the adoration of so-called relics. His character was frank and open, and he was unable to hide his convictions. He put some of his doubts before his companions, and these hastened them to refer them to the superiors. And thus was material found to institute a cause against him. It became known that he had praised the methods used by the Arians or Unitarians in expounding their doctrines, adding that they refer all things to the ultimate cause, which is the Father. This, with other heretical propositions being brought to the notice of the Holy Office, Bruno found himself in the position of being first observed and then threatened. He was warned of the danger that hung over him by some friends and decided to quit Naples. He fled from the convent and took the road to Rome, and was there received in the monastery of the Minerva. A few days after his arrival in Rome, he learned that the instructions for his arrest had been forwarded from Naples. He tarried not, but got away secretly, throwing aside the monks' habiliments by the way. He wandered for some days about the Roman Campagna, his destitute condition proving a safeguard against the bands of brigands that infested those lands, until arriving near Civita Vecchia, he was taken on board a Genoese vessel and carried to the Ligurian port, where he hoped to find refuge from his enemies. But the city of Geneva was devastated by pestilence and civil war, and after a sojourn of a few days he pursued once more the road of exile. Seeking for a place wherein he might settle for a short time and hide from his pursuers, he stayed at the steps of Noli, situated a short distance from Savona, on the Riviera. This town, nestled in a little bay surrounded by high hills crowned by feudal castles and towers, was only accessible on the shore side, and offered a grateful retreat to our philosopher. At Noli Bruno obtained permission of the magistracy to teach grammar to children, and thus secured the means of subsistence by the small remuneration he received. But this modest employment did not occupy him sufficiently, and he gathered round him a few gentlemen of the district to whom he taught the science of the sphere. Bruno also wrote a book upon the sphere, which was lost. He expounded the system of Copernicus and talked to his pupils with enthusiasm about the movement of the earth and the plurality of worlds. As in that same Liguria Columbus first divined another hemisphere outside the Pillars of Hercules, so Bruno discovered to those astonished minds the myriads of worlds which fill the immensity of space. Columbus was derided and banished by his fellow citizens, and the fate of our philosopher was similar to his. In the humble schoolmaster who taught grammar to the children, the bishop, the clergy, and the nobles who listened eagerly to his lectures on the sphere began to suspect the heretic and the innovator. After 5 months it behooved him to leave Noli. He took the road to Savona, crossed the Apennines, and arrived in Turin. In Turin at that time reigned the great Duke Emanuele Filiberto, a man of strong character, one of the men who knew how to found a dynasty and to fix the destiny of a people. At that time, when central and southern Italy were languishing under home and foreign tyranny, he laid the foundations of the future Italy. He was a warrior, artist, mechanic, and scholar. Intrepid on the field of battle, he would retire from deeds of arms to the silence of his study, and cause the works of Aristotle to be read to him. He spoke all the European languages. He worked at artillery, at models of fortresses, and at the smith's craft. He brought together around him from all sides of Italy artisans and scientists to promote industry, commerce, and science. He gathered together in Piedmont the most excellent compositors of Italy, and sanctioned a printers' company. Bruno, attracted to Turin by the favor that was shown to letters and philosophy, hoped to get occupation as press reader. But it was precisely at that time that the Duke, instigated by France, was combating, with every kind of weapon, the Waldensian and Huguenot heresies, and had invited the Jesuits to Turin, offering them a substantial subsidy. So that on Bruno's arrival he found the place he had hoped for as teacher in the university occupied by his enemies, and he therefore moved on with little delay and embarked for Venice. Berti, in the life of Bruno, remarks that when the latter sought refuge in Turin, Torquato Tasso, also driven by adverse fortune, arrived in the same place, and he notes the affinity between them, both so great, both subject to every species of misfortune and persecution in life, and destined to immortal honors after their death. The light of genius burned in both of them. The fire of enthusiasm flamed in each alike, and on the forehead of each one was set the sign of sorrow and of pain. Both Bruno and Tasso entered the cloister as boys. The one joined the Dominicans, the other the Jesuits, and in the souls of both might be discerned the impress of the order to which they belonged. Both went forth from their native place longing to find a broader field of action and greater scope for their intellectual powers. The one left Naples carrying in his heart the pagan and Christian traditions of the noble enterprises and the saintly heroism of the Olympus and of Calvary, of Homer and the Fathers, of Plato and St. Ignatius. The other was filled with the philosophical thought of the primitive Italian and Pythagorean epics, fecundated by his own conceptions, and by the New Age. Philosopher and apostle of an idea, Bruno consecrated his life to the development of it in his writings, and to the propagation of his principles in Europe by the fire of enthusiasm. The one surprised the world with the melody of his songs, being, as Dante says, the dolce serena che marinato in mezzo al mare smaga. He lulled the anguish that lacerated Italy, and gilded the chains which bound her. The other tried to shake her, to recall her to life with the vigor of thought, with the force of reason, with the sacrifice of himself. The songs of Tasso were heard and sung from one end of Italy to the other, and the poet dwelt in palaces and received the caress and smiles of princes, while Bruno, discoursing in the name of reason and of science, was rejected, persecuted, and scourged, and only after 3 centuries of ingratitude, of calumny, and of forgetfulness does this country show signs of appreciating him and of doing justice to his memory. In Tasso, the poet predominates over the philosopher. In Bruno, the philosopher predominates over and eclipses the poet. The first sacrifices thought to form. The second is careful only of the idea. Again, both are full of a conception of the divine, but the God that the dying Tasso confessed is a God that is expected and comes not, while the God that Bruno proclaims he already finds within himself. Tasso dies in his bed in the cloister, uneasy as on a bed of thorns. Bruno, amidst the flames, stands out as on a pedestal, and dies serene and calm. We must now follow our fugitive to Venice. At the time Giordano Bruno arrived in Venice, that city was the most important typographical center of Europe. The commerce and books extended through the Levant, Germany, and France, and the philosopher hoped that here he might find some means of subsistence. The plague at that time was devastating Venice, and in less than 1 year had claimed 42,000 victims. But Bruno felt no fear, and he took a lodging in the part of Venice called the Freseria, and was soon busy preparing for the press a work called Segni del Tempo, hoping that the sale of it would bring a little money for daily needs. This work was lost, as were all those which he published in Italy, and which it was to the interest of Rome to destroy. Disappointed at not finding work to do in Venice, he next went to Padua, which was the intellectual center of Europe. As Venice was the center of printing and publishing, the most celebrated professors of that epoch were to be found in the University of Padua. But at that time of Bruno's sojourn there, Padua, like Venice, was ravaged by the plague. The university was closed, and the printing houses were not in operation. He remained there only a few days, lodging with some monks in the order of St. Dominic, who, he relates, persuaded me to wear the dress again, even though I would not profess the religion it implied, because they said it would aid me in my wayfaring to be thus attired. And so I got a white cloth robe, and I put on the hood, which I was preserved when I left Rome. Thus habited, he wandered for several months about the cities of Venetia and Lombardy, and although he contrived for a time to evade his persecutors, he finally decided to leave Italy, as it was repugnant to his disposition to live in forced dissimulation, and he felt that he could do no good either for himself or for his country, which was then overrun with Spaniards and scourged by petty tyrants, and with the lower orders sunk in ignorance and the upper classes illiterate, uncultivated, and corrupt, the mission of Giordano Bruno was impossible. Altiora peto was Bruno's motto, and to realize it, he had gone forth with the pilgrim's staff in his hands, sometimes covered with the cowl of the monk, at others wearing the simple habit of a schoolmaster, or, again, clothed with the doublet of the mechanic. He had found no resting place, nowhere to lay his head, no one who could understand him, but always many ready to denounce him. He turned his back at last on his country, crossed the Alps on foot, and directed his steps towards Switzerland. He visited the universities in different towns of Switzerland, France, and Germany, and wherever he went he left behind him traces of his visit in some hurried writings. The only work of the Nolan, written in Italy, which has survived is Il Candelejo, which was published in Paris. Levi, in his Life of Bruno, passes in review his various works, but it will suffice here to reproduce what he says of the Eroici Furori, the first part of which I have translated, and to note his remarks upon the style of Bruno, which presents many difficulties to the translator on account of its formlessness. Goethe says of Bruno's writings, Zu allgemeiner Betrachtung und Erinnerung der Geistes einenden sich die Schriften des Genres Brunos von Nola, aber freilich das Gedeigen Gold und Silber aus der Masse jener so ungleich beget bin, ersegang auszuscheiden und unter den Hammer zu bringen in Vorden fast mehr als menschlich Kräfte vergolden. I believe that no translation of Giordano Bruno's works have ever been brought out in English, or, at any rate, no translation of the Eroici Furori, and therefore I have had no help from previous renderings. I have for the most part followed the text as closely as possible, especially in the sonnets, which are frequently rendered line for line. Form is lacking in the original and would, owing to the unusual and often fantastic clothing of the ideas, be difficult to apply in this translation. He seems to have written down his grand ideas hurriedly, and, as Levi says, probably intended to retouch the ideas before printing. Following the order of Levi's Life of Bruno, we next find the fugitive at Geneva. He was hardly 31 years old when he quitted his country and crossed the Alps, and his first stopping place was Chambéry, where he was received in a convent of the Order of Predicatori. He proposed going on to Lyons, but being told by an Italian priest whom he met there that he was not likely to find countenance or support, either in the place he was in or in any other place, however far he might travel, he changed his course and made for Geneva. The name of Giordano Bruno was not unknown to the Italian colony who had fled from papal persecution to the stronghold of religious reform. He went on to lodge at an inn, and soon received visits from Marchese di Vico Neapolitano, Pietro Martiri Vermigli, and other refugees who welcomed him with affection, inquiring whether he intended to embrace the religion of Calvin, to which Bruno replied that he did not intend to make profession of that religion, as he did not know of what kind it was, and he only desired to live in Geneva in freedom. He was then advised to doff the Dominican habit, which he still wore. This he was quite willing to do, only he had no money to buy other clothing, and was forced to have some made of the cloth of his monkish robes, and his new friends presented him with a sword and a hat. They also procured some work for him in correcting press errors. The term of Bruno's sojourn in Geneva seems doubtful, and the precise nature of his employment when there is also uncertain. But his independent spirit brought him into dispute with rigid Calvinists of that city, who preached and exacted a blind faith, absolute and compulsory. Bruno could not accept any of the existing positive religions. He professed the cult of philosophy and science, nor was his character of that mold that would have enabled him to hide his principles. It was made known to him that he must either adopt Calvinism or leave Geneva. He declined the former, and had no choice as to the latter. Poor he had entered Geneva, and poor he had left, and now turned his steps towards France. He reached Lyons, which was also at that time the city of refuge against religious persecution, and he addressed himself to his compatriots, begging for work from publishers, Aldo and Griffi, but not succeeding in gaining enough to enable him to subsist. After a few days he left, and went on his way to Toulouse, where there was a famous university. And having made acquaintance with several men of intellect, Bruno was invited to lecture on the sphere, which he did, with various other subjects, for 6 months. When the chair of philosophy becoming vacant, he took the degree of doctor, and competed for it. And he continued for 2 years in that place, teaching the philosophy of Aristotle and of others. He took for the text of his lectures the treatise of Aristotle, De Anima, and this gave him the opportunity of introducing and discussing the deepest human questions, upon the origin and destiny of humanity, the soul, is it matter or spirit? Potentiality or reality, individual or universal, mortal or eternal? Is man alone gifted with soul, or are all beings equally so? Bruno's system was in his mind complete and mature. He taught that everything in nature has a soul, one universal mind, penetrates and moves all things. The world itself is a sacrum animal. Nothing is lost, but all transmutes and becomes. This vast field afforded him scope for teaching his doctrines upon the world, on the movement of the earth, and on universal soul. The novelty and boldness of his opinions roused the animosity of clergy against him, and after living 2 years and 6 months at Toulouse, he felt it was wise to retire, and leaving the capital of Languedoc, he set his face towards Paris. The 2 books, the fruit of his lectures, which he published in Toulouse, De Anima and De Clavis Magis, were lost. The title of doctor, or as he said himself, Maestro delle Arti, which Bruno had obtained at Toulouse, gave him the faculty of teaching publicly in Paris, and he says, "I went to Paris, where I set myself to read a most unusual lecture, in order to make myself known and to attract attention." He gave 30 lectures on the 30 divine attributes, dividing and distributing them according to the method of St. Thomas Aquinas. These lectures excited much attention amongst the scholars of the Sorbonne, who went in crowds to hear him, and he introduced, as usual, his own ideas, while apparently teaching the doctrines of St. Thomas. His extraordinary memory and his eloquence caused great astonishment, and the fame of Bruno reached the ears of King Henry III, who sent for him for the court, and being filled with admiration of his learning, he offered him a substantial subsidy. During his stay at Paris, although he was much at court, he spent many hours in his study, writing the works that he afterwards published. Philosophical questions were discussed at the Sorbonne with much freedom. Bruno showed himself no partisan of either the Platonic or the Peripatetic school. He was not exclusive either in philosophy or in religion. He did not favor the Huguenot faction more than the Catholic League, and precisely by reason of this independent attitude, which kept him free of the shackles of the sects, did he obtain the faculty of lecturing at the Sorbonne. Nor can we ascribe this aloofness to religious indifference, but to the fact that he sought for higher things and longed for nobler ones. The humiliating spectacle which the positive religions, both Catholic and Reformed, presented at this time, the hatreds, the civil wars, the assassinations which they instigated, had disgusted men of noble mold, and had turned them against these so-called religions, so that in Naples, in Tuscany, in Venice, in Switzerland, France, and England, there were to be found societies of philosophers, of freethinkers, and politicians who repudiated every positive religion and professed a pure theism. In the Spazio della Bestia Trionfante, he declares that he cannot ally himself either to the Catholic or the Lutheran Church, because he professes a more pure and complete faith in these, to wit, the love of humanity and the love of wisdom. And Mocenigo, the disciple who ultimately betrayed and sold him to the Holy Office, declares in his deposition that Bruno sought to make himself the author of a new religion under the name of philosophy. He was not a man to conceal his ideas, and in the fervor of his improvisation, he no doubt revealed that he was. Some tumult resulted from the free speaking of Bruno's, and he was forced to discontinue his lectures at the Sorbonne. Towards the end of the year 1583, the king became enthralled by religious enthusiasm, and nothing was talked of in Paris but the conversion of King Henry. This fact changed the aspect of affairs as far as Bruno was concerned. He judged it prudent to leave Paris, and he traveled to England. The principal works published by Bruno during his stay in Paris are Il Candelaio and Ombre Idierum. The former, says Levi, is a work of criticism and of demolition. In this comedy he sets in groups the principal types of hypocrisy, stupidity, and rascality, and exhibiting them in their true colors, he lashes them with ridicule. In the Ombre Idierum, he initiates the work of reconstruction, giving color to his thought and sketching his idea. The philosophy of Bruno is based upon that of Pythagoras, whose system penetrates the social and intellectual history of Italy, both ancient and modern. The method of Pythagoras is not confirmed, as most philosophies are, to pure metaphysical speculations, but connects these with scientific observations and social practice. Bruno, having resuscitated these doctrines, stamps them with a wider scope, giving them a more positive direction, and he may with propriety be called the second Pythagoras. The primal idea of Pythagoras, which Bruno worked out to a more distinctive element, is this: numbers are the beginning of things. In other words, numbers are the cause of the existence of material things. They're not final, but are always changing position and attributes. They're variable and relative. Beyond and above this mutability, there must be the immutable, the all, the one. The infinite must be one, as one is the absolute number. In the original one is contained all the numbers. In the one is contained all the elements of the universe. This abstract doctrine required to be elucidated and fixed. From a hypothesis to concentrate and reduce it to a reality was the great work of Bruno. One is the perfect number. It's the primitive monad. As from the one proceeds the infinite series of numbers which again withdraw and are resolved into the one, so from substance, which is one, proceeds the myriads of worlds. From the worlds proceed myriads of living creatures. And from the union of one with the diverse is generated the universe. Hence the progression from ascent to descent, from spirit to that which we call matter, from the cause to the origin, and the process of metaphysics which, from the finite world of sense rises to the intelligent, passing through the intermediate numbers of infinite substance to active being and cosmic reason. From the absolute one, the sun of the sensible and intellectual world, millions of stars and suns are produced or developed. Each sun is the center of as many worlds which are distributed in as many distinct series in an infinite number of concentric centers and systems. Each system is attracted, repelled, and moved by an infinite internal passion or attraction. Each turns round its own center and moves in a spiral towards the center of the whole, towards which center they all tend with infinite passional ardor. For in this center resides the Son of Suns, the unity of unities, the temple, the altar of the universe, the sacred fire of Vesta, the vital principle of the universe. That which occurs in the world of stars is reflected in the telluric world. Everything has its center, towards which it is attracted with fervor. All is thought, passion, and aspiration. From this unity which governs variety, from this movement of every world around its sun, of every sun around its center sun, the sons of suns, which informs all the rays of the spirit, the light of thought, is generated that perfect harmony of colors, sounds, forms, which strike the sight and captivate and enthrall the intellect. That which in the heavens is harmony becomes, in the individual, morality, and in companies of human beings, law. That which is light in the spheres becomes intelligence and science in the world of the spirit and in humanity. We must study this harmony that rules the celestial worlds in order to deduce the laws which should govern civil bodies. In the science of numbers dwell harmony, and therefore it behooves us to identify ourselves with this harmony, because from it is derived the harmonic law which draws men together into companies. Through the revolution of the worlds through space around the suns, from their order, their constancy and their measure, the mind comprehends the progress, the conditions of men, and their duties towards each other. The Bible, the sacred book of man, is in the heavens. There does man find the written word of God. Human souls are lights, distinct from the universal soul, which is diffused over all and penetrates everything. A purifying process guides them from one existence to another, from one form to another, from one world to another. The life of man is more than experience or trial. It is an effort, a struggle to reproduce and represent upon earth some of that goodness, beauty, and truth which are diffused over the universe and constitute its harmony. Long, slow, and full of opposition is the educational process of the soul. As the terraqueous globe becomes formed, changed, and perfected, little by little through the cataclysms and convulsions which, by means of fire, flood, earthquakes, and eruptions, transform the earth, so it is with humanity. Through struggle is man educated, fortified, and raised. In the midst of social cataclysms and revolutions, humanity has one guiding star, a beacon which shows its light above the storms and tempests, a mystical thread running through the labyrinth of history, namely, the religion of philosophy and of thought. The vulgar creeds would not, and have not dared to reveal the truth in its purity and essence. They covered it with veils and allegories, with myths and mysteries, which they called sacred. They enshrouded thought with double veil and called it revelation. Humanity, deceived by a seductive form, adored the veil, but did not lift itself up to the idea behind it. It saw the shadow, but not the light. But we must return to our wandering hero. Bruno was about 36 years old when he left Paris and went to England. He was invited to visit the University of Oxford, and opened his lectures there with two subjects which, apparently diverse, are in reality intimately connected with each other, namely, on the quadruple sphere and on the immortality of the soul. Speaking of the immortality of the soul, he maintained that nothing in the universe is lost. Everything changes and is transformed. Therefore, soul and body, spirit and matter are equally immortal. The body dissolves and is transformed. The soul transmigrates, and drawing round itself atom to atom, it reconstructs for itself a new body. The spirit that animates and moves all things is one. Everything differentiates according to the different forms and bodies in which it operates. Hence, of animate things, some are inferior by reason of meanness of the organ in which they operate. Others are superior through the richness of the same. Thus we see that Bruno anticipates the doctrine proclaimed later by Goethe and Darwin of the transformation of species, and of the organic unity of the animal world. And this alternation from segregation to aggregation, which we call death and life, is no other than mutation of form. After having criticized and scourged the religions of chimera, of ignorance, and hypocrisy in Lo Spazio della Bestia Trionfante and in L'Asino Cellinico, the author in Gli Erioci Fiorori lays down the basis for the religion of thought and of science. In place of the so-called Christian perfections, resignation, devotion, and ignorance, Bruno would put intelligence and the progress of intellect in the world of physics, metaphysics, and morals, the true aim being illumination, the true morality, the practice of justice, the true redemption, the liberation of the soul from error, its elevation and union with God upon the wings of thought. This idea is developed in the work in question, which is dedicated to Sir Philip Sidney. After treating of the infinite universe and contemplating the innumerable worlds and other works, he comes in furori, to the consideration of virtue in the individual, and demonstrates the potency of the human faculties. After the cosmos, the microcosm, after the finitely great, the infinitely small, the body is in the soul is in the mind is in God. The life of the soul is the true life of the man. Of all his various faculties, that which rules all, that which exalts our nature, is thought. By means of it we rise to the contemplation of the universe, and becoming in our turn creators, we raise the edifice of science. Through the intellect the affections become purified, the will becomes strengthened, true liberty is acquired, and will and action becoming one through thought, we become heroes. This education of the soul, or rather this elevation and glory of thought, which draws with it will and affections, not by means of blind faith or supernatural grace, not through an irrational and mystical impulse, but by the strength of a reformed intellect, and by a palpable and well-considered enthusiasm, which science and the contemplation of nature alone can give. This is the keynote of the poem. It's composed of two parts, each of which is divided into 5 dialogues. The first part, which may be called psychological, shows by means of various figures and symbols drawn from nature, how the divine light is always present to us, is inherent in man. It presents itself to the senses and to the comprehension. Man constantly rejects and ignores it. Sometimes the soul strives to rise up to it, and the poet describes the struggle with the opposing affections which are involved in this effort, and shows how at last the man of intelligence overcomes these contending powers and fatal impulses which conflict within us, and by virtue of harmony and the fusion of the opposites, the intellect becomes one with the affections, and man realizes the good and rises to the knowledge of the true. All conflicting desires being at last united, they become fixed upon one object, one great intent, the love of the divine, which is the highest truth and the highest good. In furori, we see Bruno as a man, as a philosopher, and as a believer. Here he reveals himself as the hero of thought. Even as Christ was the hero of faith and sacrificed himself for it, so Bruno declares himself ready to sacrifice himself for science. It is also a literary, a philosophical, and a religious work. Form, however, is sacrificed to the idea. So absorbed is the author in the idea that he often ignores form altogether. In exile, wandering from place to place, he wrote hurriedly, and seldom or ever had he the opportunity of revising what he had written down. His mind and the impulsiveness of its improvisation was like the volcano of his native soil, which, rent by subterranean flames, sends forth from its vortices of fire at the same time smoke, ashes, turbid floods, stones, and lava. He contemplates the soul, and seeks to understand its language. He is a physiologist and a naturalist, merged into a mystic and the enlightened devotee. Bruno might have made a fixed home for himself in England, as so many of his compatriots had done, and continued to enjoy the society of such men as Sir Philip Sidney, Fulk Greville, and perchance also of Shakespeare himself, who was in London about that time. But his self-imposed mission allowed him no rest. He must go forth and carry his doctrines to the world, and forget the pleasures of friendship and the ties of comfort and the larger love of humanity. His work was to awaken souls out of their lethargy, to inspire them with the love of the highest good and of truth, to teach that God is to be found in the study of nature, that the laws of the visible world will explain those of the invisible, the union of science and humanity with nature and with God. Bruno returned to Paris in 1585, being at that time the tutor in the family of Mauvissier, who had been recalled from England by his sovereign. During Bruno's second sojourn in Paris, efforts were made by Mendoza, the Spanish ambassador, and others, to induce him to return to the allegiance of the Church, and to be reconciled to the Pope. But Bruno declined these overtures, and soon after left Paris for Germany, where he arrived on foot, his only burden being a few books. He visited Marburg and Württemberg, remaining in the latter place 2 years, earning his bread by teaching. Prague and Frankfurt were next visited. Ever the same courage and boldness characterized his teaching, and ever the same scanty welcome was accorded to it. Although in every city and university crowds of the intelligent listened to his lectures, but the Church never lost sight of Bruno. He was always under surveillance, and few dared to show themselves openly his friends. Absorbed in his studies and intent upon his work, writing with feverish haste, he observed nothing of the invisible net which his enemies kept spreading around him. And while his slanderers were busy in doing him injury, he was occupied in teaching the mnemonic art, and explaining the system of philosophy to young Lutherans who attended his lectures, in settling the basis of a new and rational religion, and in writing Latin verses, using ever greater diligence with his work, almost as if he felt that the time was drawing near in which he would no longer be at liberty to work and teach. It was during the early part of the pontificate of Gregory XIV that Bruno received letters from Mocenigo in Venice, urging him to return to Italy, and to go and stay with him in Venice, and instruct him in the secrets of science. Bruno was beginning to tire of this perpetually wandering life, and after several letters from Mocenigo, full of fine professions of friendship and protection, Bruno, longing to see his country again, turned his face towards Venice. In those days men of superior intellect were often to be magicians or sorcerers. Mocenigo, after enticing Bruno to Venice, insisted upon his teaching him the secret of memory and other things that he knew. The philosopher with untiring patience tried to instill into this dull head the principles of logic, the elements of mathematics, and the rudiments of mnemonic art. But the pupil hated study, and had no faculty of thought, yet he insisted that Bruno should make science clearly known to him. But this was probably only to initiate a quarrel with Bruno, whom he intended afterwards to betray and deliver into the hands of the Church. The Holy Office would have laid hands on Bruno immediately on his arrival in Italy, but being assured by Mocenigo that he could not escape, they left him a certain liberty, so that he might more surely compromise himself, while his enemies were busy collecting evidence against him. When at last his eyes became open to what was going on about him, and he could no longer ignore the peril of his position, it was too late. Bruno could not get away, and was told by Mocenigo that if he stayed not by his own will and pleasure, he would be compelled to remain where he was. Bruno, however, made his preparations for departure, and sent his things on to Frankfort, intending to leave the next day himself. But in the morning, while he was still in bed, Mocenigo entered the chamber, pretending that he wished to speak with him. Then calling his servant Bartolo and 5 or 6 gondoliers, who waited without, they forced Bruno to rise, and conducted him to a garret, and locked him in. There he passed the first day of that imprisonment, which was to last for 8 years. The next day he went over the lagoon in a gondola, in the company of his jailers, who took him to the prison of the Holy Office, and left him there. Levi devotes many pages to the accusations brought against Giordano Bruno by the inquisitors, and the depositions and denunciations made against him by his enemies. The court was opened without delay, and most of the provinces of Italy were represented by their delegates in the early part of the trial. Bruno himself, being interrogated, gave an account in detail of his life, of his wanderings, of his occupations and works. Serene and dignified before this terrible tribunal, he expounded his doctrine, its principles, and logical consequences. He spoke of the universe, of the infinite worlds and infinite space, of the divinity in all things, of the unity of all things, the dependence and interdependence of all things, and of the existence of God in all. After 9 months' imprisonment in Venice, towards the end of January 1593, Bruno, in chains, was conveyed from the bridge of Sighs through the lagoons to Ancona, where he remained incarcerated until the prison of the Roman Inquisition received him. If we look upon Gli Eroici Furori as a prophetical poem, we see that his sufferings in the loneliness of his prison and in the torture chamber of the Inquisition passed by anticipation before his mind in the book written when he was free and a wanderer in the strange lands. By what condition, nature, or fell chance, in living death, dead life I live? He writes 8 years and more before he ever breathed the stifling air of a dungeon, and again, the soul nor yields nor bends to these rough blows, but bears, exulting, the long martyrdom, and makes a harmony of these sharp pangs. Further details of the trial of Giordano Bruno are to be found in Levi's book. It is well known how he received the sentence of death passed upon him, saying, "You, O judges, feel penitence more terror in pronouncing this judgment than I do in hearing it." The day fixed for the burning, which was to take place in the Campo dei Fiori, was the 17th February of the year 1600. Rome was full of pilgrims from all parts,
come to celebrate the jubilee of Pope Clement VIII. Bruno was hardly 50 years old at this time. His face was thin and pale, with dark fiery eyes, the forehead luminous with thought, his body frail and bearing the signs of torture, his hands in chains, his feet bare. He walked with slow steps in the early morning towards the funeral pyre. Brightly shone the sun, and the flames leapt upwards and mingled with his ardent rays. Bruno stood in the midst with his arms crossed, his head raised, his eyes open. When all was consumed, a monk took a handful of the ashes and scattered them in the wind. A month later, the Bishop of Sidonia presented himself at the treasury of the Pope, and demanded 2 scudi in payment for having degraded Fra Giordano, the heretic.